All right, so are you ready to explore the amazing world of human reproduction?
Let's do it.
Today, we're taking a deep dive into, let me see, Anatomy 1, Reproduction 07.1 to 2024.pdf and Anatomy 2.pdf to uncover how we go from, well, a single cell to a whole person.
Yeah, from single cells to complex beings, that's what we're talking about.
Exactly. So how do we even begin to unpack this?
Well, it all starts with, the very foundation of life, the continuation of our species.
Okay, so we're talking about reproduction in general, but where do we even begin with that?
We have to start with the sperm and the egg.
Right, the sperm and the egg, the stars of this show. But where do those actually come from?
So they arise from these precursor cells called primordial germ cells. And what's fascinating is that these cells actually appear very early in development,
Early. How early are we talking?
way before we have like fully formed organs.
Wow, so they're already on the move that early on.
Oh, yeah. Imagine this. These tiny cells, right, carrying the potential for life, appear in the epiblast.
The epiblast. Remind me what that is again.
That's just a layer in the developing embryo.
Right, right.
And from there, they make their way to the yolk sac, kind of like the embryo's first lunchbox.
Okay, I like that analogy.
And finally, they journey to the genital ridges,
Which will eventually become
the gonads.
the future tests and ovaries.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like a microscopic quest just to get things started.
You could say that. And what's even more amazing is what happens if these primordial germ cells, don't reach their destination.
What happens? They just, disappear?
Well, not exactly. They're still there. But the thing is, this journey is critical.
Okay, I'm sensing a but coming.
Well, if they don't reach those genital ridges, the gonads won't develop the way they should.
So that's a pretty big deal then.
It shows just how interconnected everything is from the very beginning.
It's pretty wild when you think about it. How much is already happening at such a tiny scale?
It really is.
So we've got these primordial germ cells all settled in. What's next on their to-do list?
Well, this is where the paths of male and female reproductive development, they kind of diverge.
Okay, so different paths, different destinies, but same goal, right?
Right.
To create those sperm and egg cells.
You got it.
But I have a feeling it's not as simple as that.
Well, you see, the timing is completely different.
Oh, how so?
For males, spermatogenesis, that's the process of actually making sperm, doesn't even begin until puberty.
Makes sense, I guess. You're not exactly born ready to go.
Exactly. And once it starts, it's a continuous process for the rest of their lives.
Mm-hmm.
But for females, oogeogenesis, that begins during, get this, fetal development.
Wait, so females are creating eggs even before they're born?
That's right.
Wow. That's incredible.
By the time a baby girl is born, she already has all the primary oocytes or immature eggs she'll ever have.
Wow. Talk about pressure. So we're talking about millions of potential eggs just hanging out, waiting for their moment.
Well, not quite millions, but a significant number, that's for sure.
So that's why.
It really highlights the fundamental difference in these reproductive timelines between men and women.
That's for sure. It's fascinating how it's all so different.
Another interesting thing is that both of these processes, spermatogenesis and oogenesis, they both use meiosis.
Meiosis, that rings a bell. Isn't that a special type of cell division?
Exactly. And we can dive into all those nitty-gritty details a bit later.
You bet. Okay, so let's talk sperm first. What's the inside scoop on spermatogenesis, this sperm-making process?
Okay, so picture this. We're zooming into the testes, specifically the seminiferous tubules.
The seminiferous tubule.
Yeah, you can think of them like these tiny factories churning out sperm cells nonstop.
Tiny factories. That's a new one.
And it's pretty incredible when you think about it.
Okay, so paint me a picture. What's the production process like in these sperm factories?
So first, you have the spermatogonia. These are like the factory workers, the stem cells that divide and eventually become those, sleek, swimming sperm.
Okay, so the spermatogonia are the starting point. But I'm guessing they don't do it all alone.
You're right. They have a whole support system, and it's these cells called the Sertoli cells.
Sertoli cells, what's their claim to fame?
They're like the unsung heroes of sperm production. These cells, they nourish and protect those developing sperm, making sure they have everything they need to thrive.
Like a dedicated pit crew, keeping those sperm cells in tip-top shape.
And they even create this protective barrier,
A barrier? What's that all about?
It's called the blood testis barrier.
The blood testis barrier. What does that even mean?
It's like a VIP area, shielding the sperm from the body's own immune system.
Hold on. Why do they need protection from the immune system?
Because sperm cells are unique, you see.
Unique in what way?
They're haploid.
Haploid.
meaning they only have half the usual number of chromosomes, and to the immune system, they can look like, well, foreign invaders.
So they need that barrier to keep them safe.
Exactly. Without it, they'd be under constant attack.
That's pretty wild.
It is. And, within this protected environment, those spermatogonia, they undergo this amazing series of transformations.
It's information.
Like they morph into primary spermatocytes, then secondary spermatocytes, and finally spermatids.
Okay, so we've gone from spermatogonia to spermatids. It's like a cellular assembly line.
It really is.
Yeah.
But they're not ready to swim off just yet.
Of course not. What else do they have to do?
The spermatids still have to go through, a remarkable makeover.
A makeover. Okay, I'm intrigued. What kind of makeover are we talking about?
It's called spermiogenesis.
Spermatogenesis. Spermiogenesis. Are we just trying to make things sound complicated here?
I promise it's not as bad as it sounds.
Okay, so what exactly happens during spermiogenesis? How do they go from like a basic cell to this, streamlined swimmer?
Well, their nucleus, which holds all that genetic material, that condenses down to form the sperm's head.
Okay, so that's how the head is formed.
Exactly. And then the Golgi apparatus, that's like the cell's packaging center that forms the acrosome.
The acrosome now, that rings a bell, isn't that? What is the acrosome again?
You can think of it like a little cap on the sperm's head, but this cap is packed with enzymes.
Enzymes, what are those for?
Essential tools, let's say, for penetrating the egg's defenses later on.
Ah, so it's like each sperm comes equipped with its own little drill.
You got it.
Yeah.
And then finally, we can't forget about the most important part for swimming,
What's that?
the formation of the flagellum.
The flagellum, right, the sperm's tail.
Exactly. And that tail, it's powered by mitochondria. Those are the cell's energy powerhouses.
So they're like the little motors propelling the sperm forward.
Exactly.
Amazing. So much cellular engineering goes into creating these tiny swimmers. It's mind-boggling. So how many of these little guys are we talking about here?
Well, the numbers are, pretty mind-boggling. This whole process, this whole spermatogenesis process from start to finish takes about 64 days.
64 days, got it.
And a healthy male can produce, are you ready for this?
Hit me with it.
100 million sperm every single day.
100 million. You're kidding. That's like a whole city of sperm being produced every day.
I know. It's incredible, isn't it?
It really is. And to think it all starts from those tiny primordial germ cells.
And that right there is the power of a single cell.
100 million sperm a day. That's amazing.
Yeah.
But let's not forget about the egg's journey.
Oh, absolutely. Oogenesis, it's a whole different ballgame.
Right. It's not just about sheer numbers, is it?
Yeah.
So we talked about those primary oocytes just kind of hanging out, waiting for their turn. What happens next?
So each oocyte, right, it's nestled inside this follicle.
A follicle, right?
It's this tiny, fluid-filled sac in the ovary.
Like a little, protective bubble?
Yeah, you could say that. And these follicles, they're like little nurseries.
Okay, I'll make that.
Providing a cozy environment for that oocyte to grow and develop.
Cozy, I like it. So it's not just a free-for-all in there. Each oocyte has its own little VIP space.
Exactly. And this is actually where that concept of follicular atresia comes into play.
Follicular atresia, right. That was that process where, not all eggs make it, right?
Exactly. Remember how we talked about how females are born with all the eggs they'll ever have?
Yeah, it's crazy to think about.
Well, not all of those eggs are actually going to be ovulated.
Okay, so it's like a competition to see which egg is the chosen one.
In a way, yeah. Throughout a woman's reproductive life, from puberty to menopause, those follicles, they're constantly being assessed.
And most of them don't make the cut.
That's right. They undergo atresia, which basically means they just kind of, shrink and disappear.
Wow. Talk about tough love.
Yeah.
So what determines which follicles survive and which ones don't?
Well, it's a complex interplay of factors like, genetics, environmental cues, but of course, Hormones, yeah. But at the end of the day, it's all about making sure that only the healthiest, most, let's say, viable follicles are the ones that reach ovulation.
It's like a quality control system for eggs.
Exactly. Maximizing those chances of a successful pregnancy.
It's amazing how it's all designed to make sure everything works properly.
It really is.
So for the follicles that do survive this whole process, what's their journey like? What actually happens?
Well, it's this carefully orchestrated, you could say, dance of hormones and development.
Yeah, dance.
And it all revolves around, those hormones from the brain, FSH and LH.
Right, FSH and LH. Those are the big players calling the shots in the ovarian cycle, weren't they?
They are. FSH, so follicle-stimulating hormone, it does exactly what its name suggests.
It stimulates those follicles. Got it.
Yeah.
And then what?
As they grow, those follicles, they start producing estrogen.
Estrogen, that's the one that gets a bad rap sometimes.
It does, it does. But it's super important for the reproductive system.
Okay, so what does estrogen do in this whole process?
It's responsible for, like, thickening the lining of the uterus, getting it ready if a pregnancy were to occur.
So that's what's happening in the uterus while all of this is going on in the ovaries.
Exactly. It's all connected. And, estrogen, it also acts as a messenger, sending those signals back to the brain to regulate the levels of FSH and LH.
So it's like a feedback loop.
Exactly.
So FSH stimulates follicle growth, the follicles release estrogen, and estrogen then influences FSH and LH levels. It's like a perfectly choreographed dance, like you said.
Exactly. And as the follicle keeps maturing, it goes through different stages.
Different stages, like what?
So from the tiny primordial follicle, it becomes a primary follicle, then a secondary follicle.
Yeah, I'm following along. So we're going from primordial to primary to secondary. Then what?
And finally, that follicle reaches the tertiary stage, also known as the Graafian follicle.
The Graafian follicle, that one definitely rings a bell.
That's the one that actually releases the egg during ovulation.
Right. Okay, so things are getting exciting now. So the Graafian follicle, it's like prepped and ready to go. What happens next?
This is where LH, that luteinizing hormone, really takes center stage.
Okay, what does LH do?
So just before ovulation, you get this surge in LH levels.
A surge, like a big spike.
Yeah. And it's actually this surge that triggers ovulation.
The LH surge, it's like the grand finale cue.
Exactly. It causes that Graafian follicle to rupture, releasing the mature egg, now called a secondary oocyte.
A secondary oocyte, got it. So where does the egg go once it's released?
It's released into the fallopian tube.
Okay, time for a quick recap. We have the follicle maturing with the help of FSH and estrogen. Then the LH surge triggers ovulation. The egg bursts forth from the ovary, and then it starts traveling down the fallopian tube. Is that about right?
You got it.
Wow. It's incredible how it all works together. So what happens to the egg once it's in the fallopian tube? I mean, does it just wait there for a sperm to come along?
Well, it does kind of wait there, but there's actually a time limit.
Time limit? What do you mean?
That egg, it's only viable for about 12 to 24 hours after ovulation.
Really? So if a sperm doesn't show up in time, that's it?
Pretty much, yeah. If fertilization doesn't happen within that window, the egg degenerates.
Oh, wow, that's a tight deadline. It's amazing that anything ever works out. But I guess that's why there are so many sperm, right?
Exactly. It increases the chances of one reaching the egg in time.
Okay, so while all of this is happening with the egg, what's going on in the uterus, it has to be ready for action too, right?
Absolutely. While the ovaries are busy with, all that follicle development and ovulation, the uterus is undergoing its own cycle, the menstrual cycle.
Menstrual cycle, right. So it's like a whole other dance routine happening at the same time.
That's one way to put it. And just like the ovarian cycle, the menstrual cycle is all about the ebb and flow of those hormones.
Okay, so remind me again, what exactly is the menstrual cycle, and how does it relate to what's happening with the egg?
So the start of the show in the uterus is the endometrium.
The endometrium.
The inner lining of the uterus,
Yeah,
right?
right.
So the menstrual cycle is basically a series of changes in the thickness and the composition of that lining to get it ready for a potential pregnancy.
So it's all about creating the perfect environment for a fertilized egg to implant.
You got it. And, there are different phases to this cycle.
Okay, so break it down for me. What are the phases of the menstrual cycle?
It all starts with the menstrual phase, or what we usually just call, a period.
Right. That's the part that gets all the attention, but it's just one part of a much bigger cycle.
Exactly. So this phase usually lasts about, let's say, 3 to 5 days, and it's when that endometrial lining is shed.
Right, because if fertilization didn't happen, the body needs to hit the reset button.
Precisely. The menstrual flow is basically just the body cleaning house, getting rid of that lining that's no longer needed.
It's like nature's way of starting a new chapter.
That's a good way to put it.
So once the old lining is shed, what happens next?
That's when the uterus moves into what we call the proliferative phase.
A proliferative phase. What happens during that phase?
So during this phase, that endometrial lining, it starts to thicken again.
Because of?
Estrogen.
Estrogen. There it is again. Hard at work.
Always. So yeah, estrogen is essentially rebuilding that endometrium, getting it ready for a potential guest.
It's like laying down the welcome mat.
Exactly. And as it thickens, that lining also becomes more vascularized, meaning it develops more blood vessels, and that's to support a potential pregnancy.
It's amazing how the body just knows what to do to prepare for a possible pregnancy.
Isn't it? And this phase usually lasts about 9 days, kind of overlapping with that follicular phase in the ovaries, when those follicles are growing.
So while the follicles are busy prepping the egg, the uterus is getting the nursery ready.
Precisely. And if fertilization actually happens, the uterus shifts into, yet again, another phase.
Another phase. This is getting complicated.
No, I know, but stick with me. This next one is called the secretory phase.
The secretory phase, got it. What happens in the secretory phase?
This is where progesterone, that other key hormone, really takes center stage.
Progesterone.
Wait.
Right, the corpus luteum. We talked about that earlier. That's where progesterone comes from, right?
You got it. The corpus luteum is like the progesterone factory.
Okay, so what does progesterone do during this secretory phase?
It acts on the endometrial glands, causing them to secrete nutrients and other substances that are super important for a developing embryo.
So it's like upgrading that endometrial lining to a 5-star hotel for a very important guest.
Exactly. And this secretory phase, that usually lasts about 14 days.
Okay, so let's say fertilization actually happens. What happens to the corpus luteum? Does it just, fade away once it's done its job?
That's a great question. And the answer is, it depends.
It depends. On what?
On whether or not fertilization actually occurred. So if it didn't, the corpus luteum, it'll just degenerate.
Okay, so it's like, mission not accomplished, time to pack it up.
Pretty much. And as it degenerates, progesterone levels drop.
And when progesterone drops?
That's the signal for the endometrial lining to shed, which brings us back to day 1 of the cycle, the menstrual phase.
Wow, so it's all connected like a continuous loop.
It really is. But if fertilization does happen, well, then things get even more interesting.
More interesting. Okay, I'm hooked.
Okay.
What happens if an egg is fertilized? Does the corpus luteum stick around?
It does. In fact, it plays a vital role in maintaining those early stages of pregnancy.
Really? So it's not just a one-hit wonder?
Not at all. You see, when a fertilized egg implants in the uterine lining, it sends out a signal.
Signal? What kind of signal?
A hormonal signal.
What kind of hormone?
It's called human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG for short.
Wait a minute, HCG, that sounds familiar.
It should. It's the hormone that pregnancy tests detect.
Oh, wow. So even in these early stages, the embryo is already making its presence known.
That's right. It's pretty amazing. And this HCG, it's produced by the developing placenta, which, as you know, is the lifeline between the mother and the developing baby.
The placenta, right. So what does HCG actually do? Why is it so important?
It has one crucial job. It prevents the corpus luteum from degenerating.
Why is that so important?
Because remember, the corpus luteum is producing progesterone, and we need progesterone to maintain that endometrial lining and support the early stages of pregnancy.
So the embryo is basically saying, hey, corpus luteum, don't go anywhere. We need you.
That's a great way to put it. And HCG keeps that corpus luteum alive and functioning until the placenta is mature enough to take over that progesterone production.
Which happens when?
Around the end of the first trimester, roughly.
Wow, it's just incredible how the body has these feedback systems to make sure everything happens at the right time.
It really is. It highlights just how complex and how efficient the human body truly is.
It really makes you appreciate just how much is going on behind the scenes, all these intricate steps involved in something we often just call getting pregnant.
It's a whole hidden world.
It really is. And we've only just scratched the surface. It really is mind-blowing. It's like a whole other universe happening right inside of us. But, thinking about everything we've talked about so far, it makes you wonder about all the things that can go wrong,
Oh, absolutely. It's actually quite remarkable how often everything works out perfectly.
I know, right? But speaking of things going wrong, what about the sperm's journey? We talked about it being this epic adventure, but is it really as simple as fastest swimmer wins? Or are there other factors at play?
Oh, it's definitely not just about speed. It's like an obstacle course for those little swimmers.
An obstacle course. Okay, now I'm really picturing it. What kind of obstacles are we talking about here?
Well, for starters, they have to navigate the acidic environment of the vagina.
Right. That doesn't sound very hospitable.
Yeah, not exactly a welcoming committee. But luckily, semen, the fluid that carries the sperm, that actually helps to kind of neutralize that acidic environment a bit.
So it's like a buffer.
Exactly. But that's just the first hurdle, They still have to swim through the cervix.
Which is?
The opening to the uterus.
Right, of course. And that can't be easy either.
It's not. The cervix, it has its own little quirks that can either help or hinder those sperm.
Quirks like what?
Well, for example, around ovulation, that cervical mucus, It actually changes.
Changes. How so?
It becomes thinner, more slippery.
To help the sperm along.
Exactly. It's like nature's way of, paving the way for those sperm.
Wow. It's incredible how the body just optimizes itself for fertilization. But even if those sperm make it through the cervix, their journey's not over yet, right?
Nope, they still have to make their way through the uterus. And then, here's the kicker, they got to choose the correct fallopian tube.
Wait, choose the correct one?
Well, yeah.
Well,
only one fallopian tube is actually going to contain the egg.
Oh, right. So they do have to pick the right path. I never thought about it like that.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it, and scientists are still trying to figure out exactly how they do it.
That's wild. So much mystery still surrounding this whole process.
It really is.
Okay, so we've talked about the sperm's journey, but what about the egg's perspective? What actually happens when an egg is fertilized?
That's when things get really interesting. So, fertilization, that usually happens up in the fallopian tube, and it marks the very beginning of a human life.
Right, the start of something amazing. So, sperm meets egg,
Sure.
fertilization happens. Then what? What happens next?
Well, that fertilized egg, which we now call a zygote, it doesn't just sit around.
What does it do?
It starts dividing and multiplying like crazy as it makes its way down to the uterus.
It's on the move.
Yeah,
So it's not just passively floating along, it's actively growing and changing.
exactly. And that process of rapid cell division, we call that cleavage.
Cleavage, got it. And what happens during cleavage? Like, how does it actually change?
So that single-celled zygote, it becomes 2 cells, then 4, then 8, and so on, until it forms this cluster of cells.
A cluster of cells.
Yeah, and that cluster, we call that a morula.
A morula, that's a new one.
It's actually Latin for mulberry.
Mulberry.
Yeah, because if you look at it under a microscope, it kind of resembles a mulberry.
No, that's kind of cute. I like it.
So yeah, that little morula, it keeps on moving down the fallopian tube, dividing and changing as it goes.
And then what?
Well, as that morula keeps dividing, a fluid-filled cavity, it starts to form inside,
Okay.
and that transforms the morula into, get this, a blastocyst.
A blastocyst. There's so many stages to keep track of. What's so special about the blastocyst stage? Why is that one important?
The blastocyst is what actually implants in the uterine lining.
So that's where it finally reaches its destination.
Exactly. The blastocyst, you see, it has this outer layer of cells called the trophoblast.
The trophoblast. That rings a bell. Doesn't that eventually become
The placenta.
the placenta, right? The lifeline between the mother and the developing baby.
You got it. And those trophoblast cells, they're the ones that actually invade, or you could say burrow into that uterine lining to make that connection.
So it's like the blastocyst has its own little team of construction workers preparing its new home.
Exactly. And once that blastocyst is all settled in, well, that's when the real work of pregnancy begins.
That's when those cells really kick into gear. From a single fertilized egg to a whole human being.
I know, right? It's really quite amazing when you think about all the steps involved, all starting with these, microscopic events.
It really highlights, I think, just how incredible, how miraculous this whole process of reproduction really is.
I couldn't agree more. It makes you realize there's so much happening that we just never even think about.
Exactly. It's a whole hidden world, like you said. And even with everything we know, there's still so much to discover and learn about human reproduction.
Oh, absolutely. It's a field that's constantly evolving.
That's for sure. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap things up for today's deep dive. We've covered so much ground, from the tiniest cells to the complex dance of hormones, and it's just incredible how it all comes together.
It really is.
It's a testament to, the power of the human body, the miracle of life, all of it.
Well said.
So for our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey. We hope you learned something new today.